We're going to continue on the sheet that I did last week on Cultural Marxism by Vodi Bakum here. And where we left off was on your sheet, it's letter C. If you're listening or on the podcast or if you're watching online or something, this is the part about Antonio Gramsci. This was the idea of cultural hegemony. And so to recap kind of what we did on the first day, we talked how there's a lot of confusion in the church in particular on issues involving justice and involving injustice and what we should do about it, like words like oppressor and oppressed, and how do we restore justice, words like equality and equity, which are not the same thing, and equality of opportunity versus equality of result. And I mean, we can go on and on and on. There's a lot of debate within the church right now because we're a little confused on these issues. And one of the reasons we're confused on these issues is because we simply are not good in terms of expressing ourselves in a holistic Christian worldview. We have not only are we not steeped in the scripture and promoting that Christian worldview, so we actually have an alternative, but some of the language used in the culture sounds good on the surface. Because, for example, when you hear words like justice, as Christians, we're like, yeah, you read throughout the Old and New Testaments, God is concerned with justice, so I guess I should be too. Or you see words like, God is somebody who lifts up the oppressed and the marginalized. Well, that's true. Jesus talking at the Samaritan well with a woman who's had 5 husbands and isn't even a Jew. Most people didn't do that back then, right? So, there's some truths in those comments. But what has happened is, and like in a lot of these things in the postmodern, post-Christian era in which we live, the words mean different things to different people. We have to define our terms. And that's, go ahead, Michelle, what are you going to add?
It's like talking to LDS people. The words we say, the same words they say are completely different.
Yeah, definitions matter, right? Yes. Words matter, definitions matter. And so what we're doing in this, so part of the reason we're studying this through Vodi Bakum, who's, again, he's got his he's got his doctorate from a Baptist seminary in the South. He also did postdoctoral work at Oxford, and he heads up African Christian Seminary or African Christian University in Zambia. So, this he's been everywhere, he's done everything, he's seen it all. And he's been talking about these issues since like 2004. So before Barack Obama was elected as president, before all this stuff about police and Black Lives Matter, and before, all that stuff, before any of that stuff, he was already talking about this. So now this, in other words, he's not like new, and he has evidence of that. So this is not like he's new to all of this. This is something he's been talking about for a while as an African-American pastor. He's been dealing with this. And so because of that, we need to define our terms. And so he uses the term, and not everybody loves it, but it is used in academic circles. He uses the term cultural Marxism. That's what you have in B, as opposed to classical Marxism. So what we talked through last week is that classical Marxism is mostly a system about economics, meaning that you have people who have the means of production. That's your ruling class, right? The bourgeois, the bourgeoisie, right? They're the ruling class. They have the means, they have the capital, right? The means of production, all the wealth. And that the underclass, all the workers of the world, the workers and the farmers and people like that, the laborers, common day laborers, they don't ever get to see the fruits of their labor, right, is the idea, and that they're being exploited by the capitalist class. And he believed that history was eventually going to kind of inevitably lead to a socialist communist revolution. Now, again, those terms aren't equal, but he was socialistic and he was communistic. They're kind of different. But he thought it was inevitable, that history was going to unfold. We had ancient times, like with pharaohs, where they just basically made everybody build their pyramids. Then we had feudalism, right, with manors and lords. And then we had capitalism. And then the next step was going to be communism, a classless society. And so he believed in that. And he was rabidly atheistic in terms of our worldview. And we talked about him in the first semester in the modern self. He very much rejected any sort of transcendent meaning outside of what we existed. He coined the term opiate of the masses when it comes to faith, meaning that people look at this because it promises them something and they put their hopes in it. And he says it kind of sedates them or gives them kind of a drug that prevents them from realizing their class consciousness on who they really are as a member of this working class. So we need to get rid of religion so that the workers of the world would unite and cast off their capitalist overlords, right? That sort of thing. That's classical Marxism. Okay, and he spent some time in it, and you have it on your handout, and we talked about it last week, but just to define our terms and recap. Then he gets to something called cultural Marxism, because what ends up happening is that revolution that all of Marx's followers thought was inevitable sort of happened, but mostly didn't. It sort of happened in the Soviet Union, Russia, where it was like least expected to happen. And it was a very brutal and top-down form of it. It kind of happened in China, but again, with a very Chinese stamp. North Korea is more of like worshiping the state, if anything, Juche. So it's not even full communism. And then you see things like Cuba and Venezuela, sort of, but it never really connects anywhere, right? And so they asked themselves, these Marxist scholars and revolutionaries, why didn't it work? Why didn't the revolution connect? And the reason is Marx was only concerned about economics. He got this wrong. There's more than just economics. There's other things, other powers, other forces, other sources of meaning in the culture that prevent people from realizing their class consciousness and casting off their overlords. So Antonio Gramsci, and again, these are just like bookends. I mean, there's other people that advocate for this stuff, but it's nice to have a name on these things. Gramsci just invented the term cultural hegemony. And in world history, we use this term, a hegemonic power. The dominant power is what that means. So, if you go back to, the first century AD, Rome would have been the hegemonic power in the Mediterranean. Does that make sense? So it's a term that's not necessarily bad. It just means the dominant power, the dominant structure. So Rome would have been that. Alexander the Great's empire would have been the hegemon. Back in the time of the ancient, in the Old Testament, you might have had Babylon as the regional hegemon, right? So there's nothing wrong with that term necessarily. But what he means by it is who controls the system of power? Who's, quote unquote, the man, right? Who's the man that's preventing us, and what tools are they using to prevent us from having this inevitable revolution? And in America, that looks like, here's the cultural hegemon: white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, native-born Americans. That's the man. And in Vodi Bakun's presentation, he goes, you all know who you are, right? He's being facetious, okay? And at any of those places where you're not those things, you're at war with those things, right? Does that make sense? Because in your class consciousness, you're not aware that those people are keeping you down. That's the man. And so that's why you can have people who seem like normally would be at opposing odds somehow be allies in today's culture. So for example, when it comes to, let's say you have somebody who is not European in descent, is lesbian, and is female. Why in the world would they be allying themselves with, for example, with Muslim extremists? It makes no sense, right? Because if there's anybody that would actually be a threat to them, it would be them, right? It would be the Muslim extremists, right? You saw what ISIS did, right? Jumping people off buildings and stuff like that. Why would they ally themselves in America? Why? Because they're both at war with the hegemonic power. You see what's going on here? So in other words, your enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Have you ever heard that statement here? Because normally, if you were in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or Iran, that would never fly. But in America, because of the ideology here, so somebody who's very much an advocate looks at that person that's really usually would be their enemy and says, all right, I don't agree with them right now, but right now we have a bigger fish to fry, and that's the man, the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, usually Christian is included too, or Judeo-Christian, something like that, or Abrahamic, something, whatever word you want to use, but Christian, we'll just say Christian in America, okay? And they are those privileged people. We need to take them out for now. Later on, we can work this stuff out later, and if we have to oppose them later, we will. But right now, that's our goal, is taking out the man. Okay, so how do we fix it? According to Gramsci, it's what some people have termed the long march through the institutions. Okay, so it's through roads. So professors, pastors, teachers, politicians, judges, you leverage those places to start your revolution. You can't just have a violent revolution, right, where where all the workers just grab guns. It just didn't work. So what we really need is we need those places to be overturned, this long march through the institutions, and then maybe when you educate enough people, they've recognized for a long time, it's the people who control education. It's the next generation and the generation after that. Those are the folks that we need to take on. So Christian schools like Grace Lutheran don't like that, right? Do not like that, okay? And public school teachers who teach like constitutional freedom and stuff like that, right? Don't like that either. Okay, because we don't, so it's not just public or private, it's the ideology, right? So they want to kind of take that over. Okay, so gain power by being an advocate for various agreed groups in those settings. And there are video now, and actually somebody just got fired. I'd have to find it. You'd have to look at the news story yourself. But a California teacher got fired for just admitting on camera basically saying, oh yeah, I'm teaching my kids to be advocates and to be revolutionaries. Like, he's just honest. Yeah, we're not really studying history. He was like a government teacher or something. It's not about history or government. It's about, teaching these kids to be, advocates and to be revolutionaries. That's what he was doing in the classroom. Now, that's an extreme example, of course. Most people don't know this, or they use some of the language, but not all the language. So, it's not like there's thousands of teachers doing this, but there's just enough. There's just enough, and you can see the effort being made. Okay, so you can see it in schools of education. So that's Gramsci. So that's what we did last week. What we need to go now to is the second side of this for cultural Marxism, and it's on the back side of your paper, and that's the Frankfurt School. This is where we get the term critical theory. So if you've ever heard terms like critical race theory, critical feminist theory, critical legal studies, critical gender, you get all these critical theories. Sometimes this is just called theory. This comes from this. This starts with the Frankfurt School. And this is probably the definition. If you want to say somebody, what is cultural Marxism? Say it's the Frankfurt School. Gramsci, sort of, but definitely the Frankfurt School. And so I'm going to let Vodi Bakum walk you through the Frankfurt School a little bit. And a lot of things are going to be familiar. Yes?
What time period was Gramsci in?
Gramsci's right before World War II and during World War II. He actually gets thrown in jail by the fascists, by Mussolini. So 20s, 30s, think 1920s and 30s is Gramsci.
And then the
Frankfurt School, you're going to get their dates right here, but it's right after, it's actually during and after World War II. So it's going to be 40s, 1940s, 1950s. In fact, they leave because of Hitler and fascism, similar to Gramsci. So instead of getting thrown in jail, they leave. And he'll give you a little bit of timeline. They end up at Columbia University. Okay, and so you're gonna see what's happening there. It's called the Institute for Social Research. You might have heard this before. And some of these names, like Marsus, is very familiar. Herbert Marsus, very popular with the New Left. Theodore Adorno is another name you might hear. He's going to list some of these, but the Frankfurt School in particular takes root here. So Gramsci, people that are in the know who he is and they agree with him. It's the Frankfurt School in particular that you're going to recognize a lot of verbiage and a lot of common things that you're going to see. You're going to recognize not only critical theories, but things like we're interrogating the American dominant narrative, or we are problematizing, normal-bodied peoples, or like why we have things like fat studies. And what is going on? This is coming from this. That's coming from critical theory. And theory, you can even get rid of the critical. Some people just call this theory. It's like their overarching worldview when they look at the world around them. It's their set of glasses. Okay, and so I'm going to reference a book here in just a second. I'll show it to you right now. So Vodi Bakum, of course, the one that, if you haven't seen, people can see it. He's known for Fault Lines. This is his main book, and he has another talk we'll look at later this semester called Fault Lines at Patrick Henry College. Now, I don't agree with every single word written. He's not a Lutheran, okay? He's a Reformed Baptist. So we have some things that we would say differently, right? We do, okay? He wrote this very quickly and some other things. I think it'll probably come out in another edition, just some editing, right? In terms of some sourcing and some other things that I think he's going to clean up a little bit. So is it a perfect book? No, but it's a good read and it's a quick read. That's one of the things you can get through this pretty quickly and it's very accessible. A denser read by non-Christians, if you have not seen this yet, and this is by two progressive liberals who see the problem, is this one. It's called Cynical Theories. Okay, Cynical Theories. This came out in 2020. Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. James Lindsay is a PhD in math. He's an atheist. So the danger about this is you will not always agree with his conclusions. You know what I'm saying? And some of his solutions might be worse, or he might not understand how some of his worldview leads to some of this stuff. You know what I'm saying? But he realizes that this is a big problem for things like academic freedom and that sort of thing. That's James Lindsay. Helen Pluckrose is a British liberal female English professor. So somebody you would think, you know what I'm saying, if you would stereotype somebody, and she's on this too. There's another guy who's not on this book, but it's kind of part of their trio. His name is Peter Pegrosian. He was a teacher at Portland State and just stepped down in the last year because of some of the stuff going on. Okay, and so they did something called the Grievance Studies Affair. We'll look at that later. I can't show it online because there's some crudities in it. They bleep some of it out, but I just don't feel good. You know what I'm saying? Because they're not Christians. So they're very progressive. They have very progressive views on things like gender and sexuality. But they realize that some of the stuff you're going to see Bakum explain is a problem, even for them, for things like academic freedom. So this is a very fascinating read. And so Cynical Theories, and the subtitle, if you can't see it in the back, is How Activist Scholarship Made Everything about race, gender, and identity and why this harms everybody. Again, they're not Christians. And so one of the frustrations I have with this, and it's just because of worldview, is their solutions are not that good, or they're not really solutions. You know what I mean? And so that's the thing. But I do like the glasses, how we look at everything through like the rainbow glass. You see what I'm saying? That's their kind of thing. So critical theories, it's recommended by tons of people from very different areas. One of the recommenders is Alan Sokal, the Sokal affair from the 1990s. You don't know that, so look up Sokal, where he wrote fake journal articles with a bunch of gibberish and got them published. He's recommending this because he put his finger on this 20 years ago. You know what I mean? 30 years ago. So I will maybe refer to that just to let you know. Okay, so back to this now. I want to show you Bauckham on the Frankfurt School. We'll stop him. And if I have time, I'm going to show you some slides on intersectionality and what that is, because it's related to all of this stuff. And we'll see how far we can get today. But that was just kind of my long, labored introduction. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Some of us were online. Some of us were, it's a lot. It's a lot. So I want to make sure that we're kind of talking about the same stuff. So here's Voddie Bauckham on the Frankfurt School. Okay, so you can hear what this is about. You'll recognize a lot of this. Maybe.
The Frankfurt School. Let me give you this quickly. The Frankfurt School refers to a collection of scholars. Collection of scholars in Frankfurt, Germany. These individuals who were known for developing critical theory and popularizing the dialectic method of learning by interrogating society's contradictions, and it's most closely associated with the work of a number of German philosophers during the early 20th century. They saw a couple of things that for them explained why the revolution didn't happen. And for them, part of it was the fact that people were receiving so much information through mass media. Remember, this is the early 20th century. Radio, just coming around. TV, not so much. So people weren't necessarily associating and interacting with each other like they had been in the past, but were receiving information through things like newspapers and radios and so on and so forth. So one of the main goals of the Frankfurt School was to leverage these tools in order to bring about the change in the hegemonic powers. Reduce everything to discussions of race, class, gender, sex. And notice I use both of those because sex and gender are two different things, right? Sex has to do with your biology, gender, social construct. Your gender doesn't necessarily have to match your sex. Are we aware of this? And if your gender doesn't match your sex, then you are transgender as opposed to cisgendered. For those of you who are wondering what that was, cisgendered. Cisgendered just means that you're not special. The Frankfurt School was concerned with mass media and the mass media culture. Saw people becoming passive recipients of political and ideological information instead of being activists. And they believed that this explained why the revolution didn't take place. They theorized that this experience made people intellectually inactive and politically passive as they allowed mass-produced ideologies and values to wash over them and to infiltrate their consciousness. Because of what happened in World War I, they left Germany. And in 1933, they went to Switzerland. But they only stayed there for a couple of years. And in 1935, they came to New York and became affiliated with Columbia University. There's a man by the name of Pegrosian. I probably didn't say his name correctly. He came to the United States fleeing the Nazis in Eastern Europe. fleeing the Nazis in Hungary. And he wrote a book called America's 30 Years' War. And essentially his thesis was this. He ran away from what was happening in Europe by force, only to come to the United States and watch it happen gradually over the course of a generation. So what do these guys give us? A number of things. Namely, critical theory. Have you heard the idea of critical race theory? It's a grandchild of the Frankfurt School. Political correctness. Multiculturalism. Any of these things sound familiar? So as a result of these ideologies, we have all been taught over time, through our media, through our educational systems, to view ourselves not as part of a whole, but as part of subgroups. As part of subgroups who in some way, shape, fashion, or form are being oppressed by the hegemonic power that rules and governs our culture. And so even when we talk about elections, we don't talk about this person is ahead in the polls by this much, that person is... No. This person is ahead with red-headed, left-handed white people from the South, while this person is getting the vote of second-generation migrant workers with eczema. Why do we talk like that? Why do we think about politics that way? Why do we think about each other that way? Why do ideas like intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 gain such popularity that people use it like we know what it is? By the way, if you don't know what intersectionality is, just what's the hegemonic power? White, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, native-born American people. That's the man, right? You ever heard that saying, the man keeping us down? That's the man. And by the way, the list could go on and on and on. Intersectionality, in a nutshell, basically is the idea that to the degree that you don't have those things, you are oppressed. And so if you are male, heterosexual, cisgendered, right, native-born, American, able-bodied, by the way, also attractive, there's pretty privilege too, by the way. If you are all those things, but you're not white, right, then your oppression is limited to this area. But what if you're not white, but you're also not male? Now, that place where your not whiteness and your not maleness intersects is where you feel the weight of the oppression. But what if you're not white and not male and not heterosexual? Well, now the oppression is even worse on you because you have these three intersections of oppression. What if you're not white, not male, not heterosexual, and not cisgendered? Ooh. So now you are a black, trans male, lesbian, Anyway, you're... Now there are 4 intersections of oppression, right? Well, if you're not white and you're not male and you're not heterosexual and you're not cisgendered and you're not able-bodied, or you're not a native-born American, you're an immigrant, or you're not a... You see, intersectionality says that the level of oppression and the kind of oppression that you experience combines itself in these areas and layers itself in these areas, these intersections, if you will. But what is that if not a grown-up expression of cultural Marxism? By the way, when people use the term racism today, the term racism, you got to be careful and you got to understand what people are talking about. Because when people say racism, they could mean you are being accused of being an individual who has racist, prejudicial ideas toward other individuals. Or they could just be saying that you are a person who is part of the cultural hegemony, which, by the way, is inherently racist against people who are not white, male, heterosexual. Which means that now you have racism without a racist. By the way, how do you handle that? Racism in the heart of an individual. Let's go to the book. Amen? Let's go to the book. Let's call that what it is. But racism that exists because of cultural hegemony. How do you fix that? Now, instead of a preacher, you've become a politician. Because the only way to fix that one is to change the hegemony. Do you see why these ideas matter? And so the very ways in which we think about ourselves, the very ways in which we think about issues, the very ways, and this is why sometimes you can feel like you're having a different conversation than another person. A prime example is the Mike Brown case. I mean, I got absolutely hammered.
As a review, this is the Ferguson, Missouri stuff, the Mike Brown case, right? Where he's like this huge 300-pound dude. And there was this line going over, hands up, don't shoot, that sort of thing, which never happened. Right. Even the Obama-led Justice Department said it never happened. You know what I'm saying? Like, however, that doesn't matter. Okay, and actually, Bodhi Bakum, one of the reasons this book is great is he goes through several of these famous cases in the media and shows you like what the actual report says, as opposed to like what the media said about it. And then he gives you 3 or 4 other cases you've never heard of. And he's like, why do we hear about it? Because it's for the narrative, right? The story of trying to take out the hegemonic power. But he goes through some of these. But the Mike Brown case, he's going to spend some time on this. I want to save some of this because I want to talk about this intersectionality thing a little bit more. So I'm going to save this. But this is where he's going to talk about the Mike Brown case. But he's going to say he got hammered because he didn't go with the existing narrative. You know, and then people that shared him also got hammered for not going with that existing narrative. So he's going to talk through. So that was Ferguson, because that kind of started some of this stuff that we're experiencing now, sort of. The Ferguson one, another one was Trayvon Martin's case, where the President of the United States came out and said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon or whatever, and that really kind of publicized it. There was another one, Eric Garner, New York City. That was one with selling illegal cigarettes and that whole thing. And then, of course, the most famous last 2 years was the stuff that happened in Minnesota, right? Minneapolis, okay, right? So when you go through all of those different things and it kind of compiles, he goes through a lot of those cases. There's another one where there was a shooting in like Louisville, I think, Kentucky. That one's talked about. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch. He goes through almost all of it. I think her name was Breonna Taylor or Breonna something. So he goes through all that and actually explains those cases, which is really interesting, and shows you how when they're interpreted, it's very different than what's actually in the reports, and not just from the police, just from in general. Like I said, the Obama Justice Department actually assessed some of these, but you never heard the results of those assessments. And so he goes through why. So anyways, just so you know, he's going to talk about those, and we'll get there again because I don't want to focus specifically on that one yet. Does that make sense? So I want to save it in my back pocket. I want to talk more about this intersectional idea. So I'm going to load this up, and I have some slides. And I actually go through this with my high school students that are seniors in either government class or apologetics, because when they all go to college, they're going to hear this, right? So I'm just telling you, this is what you will hear, and now you got to be ready to respond. And that's like, we live in an era of vaccinations. So as a high school teacher, and honestly as a teacher in the church, I feel like that God has designed me to be an equipper, like a teacher that just tells people what's going on and tries to give them tools to be able to address the culture, to understand the times. I feel like that God has called me to that, whether it's here with young people or in the church side that you're all here right now, it's to be that person that tries to teach and show worldviews, exposing things to what they are, but also help encouraging people to cling to that classic Christian worldview. That's just how I'm built. So we do this at the school. So this intersectionality thing, before I even do that, remember one of the things I set up here, and it might take a second for my clicker to recognize. Remember, what are our texts for this? This is with Paul on Mars Hill. What's the Christian worldview here, the Areopagus? So then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, God, who made the world and everything in it. That is a transcendent worldview. See, already we've got an issue. This means it's everybody. Nobody's exempt, okay? Everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth. This is the king. Yeah, brother, he's the king. He's not the king that people want him to be king. He's just the king. That's just who he is by nature, okay? He does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, right? Solomon says that when he builds a temple. Can the Lord really dwell here, right? Since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. So this is the important part on this critical race theory and also on intersectionality and all these critical theories. This is the important part. He is made from one blood, every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. We're all related. Okay, our identity comes from God. We're all created in his image. There's not a single person that Christ did not die for. We start there. Okay, that's where we begin. And has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. I mean, the Greeks even knew this, okay? But this is just interesting to think through that this is, again, we start here with our worldview. We don't start with this next stuff, which is intersectionality. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that we remember our worldview here, okay? We don't start here, we start there. We have a different anthropology. Make sense? By the way, if you want to know something, where this is really dominant, where that sort of ideology is dominant, is in the social sciences. Okay, so history, anthropology, psychology, sociology, it's really dominant there. What some people call soft sciences sometimes, as opposed to like chemistry. Very dominant in those social science fields, and also dominant in schools of education. Because in the schools of education, you take all those theories and put them together and then come up with see how this works? It kind of gets recombined. So schools of education. So the main soft sciences, which includes almost everything that I teach, political science would be another one there, right? So when I teach government, U.S. history, Western Civ, history of the art, I mean, all the stuff that I do, basically, it's dumb. That's why I know something about this, because it's everywhere. I try picking out a textbook, and I can't pick out a textbook, okay, right? My American history textbook is from 1985. It's an Oxford University textbook, and then I just supplement. I just heavily supplement because I can't, you know what I mean? I can't pick out another textbook because of the way things have, that's just something to throw out there. All right.
It's in hard sciences too, because look at the math books.
Right. Yeah, it's starting to get to that point, right, where it's impacting the hard sciences. It's just at a harder go of it because there's less interpretation on an algebra problem, right? Or like how a chemistry formula. But it is starting. You're right.
We forget
Yeah, that's how we do it, right? We do it in these, on like the side things. You don't just teach math, you teach math through the lens of that sort of thing. I want to get into this before we get too much in the weeds. Okay, so it starts in the 80s and 90s. If you don't know what intersectionality is, it was coined by a professor, I think she was at Rutgers at the time, named Kimberly Crenshaw. And not everything about this, and I said this last week a little bit, not everything about this is all wrong. There's just enough truth there to make this seductive. So in other words, like I said last week, a Puerto Rican woman in New York City has a different experience than a white woman in Buell, Idaho. That's just common sense. We all agree with that everybody has different experiences. I grew up in northern Montana, right? Geography matters. If I would have grown up in Arizona, I would have had a different childhood experience growing up in Arizona, right? I mean, it's just, so some of this is common sense. So the reason this is seductive is there's like little nuggets of truth underneath it, but it's been transformed into an entire framework to interpret the world and culture and politics and theology and everything, right? It's completely, so it's, you take an okay observation and then transform it. And so radical feminism was one of the ways this was shown, because she was saying that all you feminists out there talking about this like woman's experience, my experience as a black woman is different than yours. You see how that kind of started? And so there, again, there's some truth in that. You get what I mean by that? Like, it's not like all evil. It's not like a bad observation. So she started out just saying, hey, you're speaking like you're speaking for all of us when you can't, because you don't speak for me or people like me. You see where this is coming from? So to put the best foot forward, to try to at least understand where the worldview is, it's important that we do that first, so then we can address it fairly. We don't want to make a straw man of the position and then knock down the straw man when they're like, well, I never believed that in the first place, right? We got to be careful. That's a logical fallacy. So to put the best foot forward, it was a way of trying to show how people have different experiences. The problem is you're now going to basically interpret all of your reality, or not necessarily all of your reality, the majority of your reality, through these lenses. So this is why you'll have some people say things like, well, this is just a tool. It's not a threat, it's just a tool. And that's where they're coming from. Does that make sense? That's why they're saying that language, it's just a tool, is because well, that's not my whole worldview. I just use this to analyze certain things. The problem is they don't realize when people use these tools that they're coming from a specific worldview, that they have an agenda behind them, even if some of the people that are using them don't necessarily mean negative things about them. Bauckham says that at the beginning of his talk, by the way. He'll say not every single person that uses these necessarily is a cultural Marxist. They just don't understand where these terms come from and what they mean. You know what I'm saying? Not every single person. So just to make sure that we're fair and as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, as Christ says, we got to make sure we understand this in a way that's at least helpful. But anyways, that's where it has its start. Late 1989 was when she kind of started making this popular. And so let's look at some of this other stuff. It has influence from cultural Marxism. Again, there's your Frankfurt School there. But it's not just cultural Marxism, okay? It's also heavily, and this is important to understand, this is where, when somebody say, well, they're just Marxists, this gets confusing. And I'll admit that this gets confusing. It's also heavily wedded to postmodernism, in which there's no such thing as absolute truth, or that language itself is power. Have you ever heard somebody say, speak your truth to power?
Yep.
Isn't that a weird comment? Well, in postmodernism, it's not, because speech patterns are power because they reflect the hegemonic power. Remember the hegemonic power, right? So when we use certain words like gendered language, that comes from a position of privilege, because a patriarchal society creates gendered language. You see what I mean? Or privileged language, or white language, or you see what I mean? Or like even the rules of grammar are done by those who are in power. So if somebody speaks, back in the 1980s, this is called Ebonics, right? When somebody speaks Ebonics, that's not bad grammar. The only reason you think it's bad grammar is because good grammar is defined by the hegemonic power.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I remember all
Do you remember this? See this discussion? So imagine, now apply that in all other areas. Music, art, history, language. You see what's going on here? And so there's no right or wrong because of postmodernism. There's no one right way to speak. There's no one right way to spell. There's no one right way to write music. There's no one, you see what's in it? So it's not classical Marxism, because in classical Marxism, there is a right way. There is a right way to do something, which is to overturn the systems of power so that we can have a classless society where all the workers own the means of production. There's a clear goal. There's a clear meaning to history. There's a clear, you see what I'm saying? So in Marxism, it's very clear. Postmodernism rejects classical Marxism because it's an overarching meta-narrative of history. They reject that. So we got to be careful, because and this is where, like last year, the Idaho legislature, for example, was talking about critical race theory and how it's, backdoor communism. And I'm like, yeah, kind of. Do you see what I mean by that?
Right.
Because it's not really, in a way. It's different than that, because it's wedded to postmodernism, and it's wedded to like these legal studies and other things where it's not quite the same. So I got a little jinky about it, because I'm like, I kind of agree with what they're doing, but no, because and so what it allows, when you're not specific and you don't actually do the homework, it allows the people that are your opponents to say, well, I don't believe that anyways. Or that it's just a tool, or that we're just teaching history, or whatever, whatever it is, you know what I'm saying? And so when you're not precise and you're not specific and you don't know what you're actually talking about, it allows people that are opposed to you to say, well, they're just against teaching real history. Or they're just, see how that works? Yeah. And so that's why I'm like, we got to be more specific. We got to be better about this as far as this. It's very postmodern. And critical theories talks about this a ton. And this is why they don't like it, is because of the postmodernism. Because he's a math professor. See, and math is very absolute. Math is very precise. Math is universal. 2 + 3 = 4. It doesn't matter what your culture is, right? So he sees that and he's like, this is a big problem. I don't think people know this, right? How this postmodern idea. So remember that this is not just it's postmodernism, and that's why I have that third head on my dog. That's why. And so you've got to remember that there's no such thing as absolute truth. So what determines your truth? Your stories determine your truth. So this is why you say, well, tell me your stories of oppression or how you've experienced. And if that's your truth, even if you're interpreting it wrongly, that's still your truth. See how this is postmodernism? So in other words, if, for example, if there was a gay black man in Dallas, if he tells you his story of oppression and says, I've experienced oppression and injustice, because there's no absolute truth, you can't criticize that at all. If you do, or you say, well, I don't believe that, or I think you're interpreting that wrongly, then you would only say that if you're privileged, number one, or because there's no such thing as absolute truth. I've told you my truth, and how dare you judge me for my truth? That is something that's oppressive, or you're not listening to my injustice. If you want to believe my truth, not only do you have to believe it, you've got to advocate for me. You've got to do the work of advocacy. Or in the words of Abraham X. Kendi, you must do the work of anti-racism. You ever heard that before? Yeah. It's not enough to just not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. Right. If you've ever, you see where this is coming from? Yeah. Because I've told you the story. I've told you the narrative. How dare you debate? See? Because it's my story. So this is very postmodern. You got to realize that you're against postmodernism on this. It's not just about competing truth claims. It's whether or not truth itself is even a thing. Or if what we call truth is itself a tool of the hegemonic power. See? That's you got to try to understand the mindset. And when you understand the mindset, it's a little less scary, but it's also more frustrating. Yeah. Okay, because it's a little less. Because right now, like he said, Areopagus, it's like we're having two different conversations. That's why you got to try to understand where they're coming from. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit. Some of this in practice. I want to just kind of show you some of this intersectionality here. Let's see. Oh, it says adds to or changes classic Marxism. That's a footnote that we don't really need. All right, next slide. Come on now. It's lagging on me because I've got the thing streaming for me, so hopefully it works its way out here. There we go. There you go. It's just going to take a second. It'll do it. So all areas of thought are impacted by this. This is the thing that I was trying to communicate earlier, but especially in the soft sciences. But if you haven't seen this, right? Arts, politics, justice, religion, literature. The most famous one, critical race theory, comes out of critical legal studies. So it's out of the justice system and that sort of thing. And we'll talk about how this work is done and how we as Christians can respond to this. But again, you see all these different subjects. I think I told you before, this may seem odd. Make sure my kids aren't in here yet. But like my college professor at Wheaton College, conservative evangelical college, was just flabbergasted. And he's the kind of old school dude, was a missionary kid, that sort of thing, old school academic, just really did the real work, like analyzing manuscripts from the 1500s, that kind of guy. And he just did not understand. He's like, I just read an article today and I'm just baffled. He's just really honest with us as music history students. I just read an article that somehow the second movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is an act of rape. This is why. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it's a patriarchal culture. It's aggressive. And so it comes from this. But he read it. This is like 2004 or something when he said, and he was like, what in the world? He was just baffled by this because he wasn't on all the latest theories. He's just doing the research, right? That's all he wanted to do. And most people are kind of like that. So just kind of throwing that out there. Economics, of course, is the classic one. Now, if you haven't seen these charts, I want to show you, like if you go to like a diversity, inclusion, and equity training or something like that, So businesses do this. I mean, famously, Coke was criticized for this, but there are some others. I'm going to skip through this because we just did this with Vodi Bakum. You know, these ideas, race, clander, disabilities, and the list goes on. I want to show you some of the graphics that you will see so you can kind of see these that are as the way they kind of unfold. Okay, so again, the power structures and systems intersect. A Black woman has two intersecting disadvantages, right? We talked through that with Bakum. Okay, so let's just go to this next thing. I'm just speeding up because our bell rang. Okay, let's see. Here we go. These are the sort of charts you'll see here. So if you've never seen these charts, they'll show up, and again, they sound nice. Because who's against diversity, equity, and inclusion? See? Yeah.
Right.
I know better, right? You know what I'm saying? I know better. But for those who don't know better and they just want to seem like they care about their neighbors or they want a safe workplace or whatever, however it's framed. So in other words, see how that works. So this is just a graphic. It's kind of like an old Venn diagram. If you are not part of the hegemonic power, you see how they kind of all intersect. See the visual here? You'll see it that way. Sometimes you'll see more sophisticated graphics though, like this. Intersecting axes of privilege, domination, and oppression. What's interesting about this is is from 1996. This is not new. What's happened is that it's been, and this is the point of this book, Cynical Theories, is starting about 2010, it became weaponized. So for a while, it was just kind of like a postmodern theory that kind of just lists, you know, it was just kind of like a fad, you know, for academics. But starting around 2010, it became a weaponized postmodern thing that became used to silence people and to use political act. You know what I'm saying? In 2000, so that's kind of what they talk about in this. Again, not Christians, just telling you what they talk about in this. Okay. So in this case, you have these different sections of intersectionality and domination, the domination line, and it's everything. Look how many things are here. Not just skin color now. It's language. It's your economics. It's attractive. So look at that. Politics of appearance, attractive, unattractive, or ageism. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's amazing the amount of things. Able-bodied, heterosexual, European. See where Vodi Bakum's coming from on this? So if you have all of this stuff, right? If you have all this stuff, you're in your privilege because you have domination. See how this works? If you're down here, you're oppressed. See how it's like underneath the domination, you're being held down, right? So if you're poor, unattractive, non-literate, LGBTQ, you're a person of color, you're gender deviant, quote unquote. You see what I'm saying? You have this. So this is the sort of graphic. So what'll happen is you'll go to like a Coca-Cola diversity training or to a public school sometimes, diversity training. And it sounds on the surface like you're just trying to be nice to people. Say, we're just raising awareness. We're just raising awareness of what people experience. See what I mean? It's very, very challenging because, and some of you out there probably recognize this sort of stuff, right? I mean, this is the sort of stuff that you will see. Again, it's interesting, again, that the dates are really older than people think they are. So these theories are not new. What's happened is they've now finally worked their way into popular culture. And so whether it's through online or through diversity, inclusion, and equity trainings or whatever, we're going to have to define those terms, by the way, right? Like, what does diversity actually mean? Is it a demographic concept or a goal, for example? You know what I'm saying? Like, we're going to have to talk through those things, or inclusion or equity versus equality, two different things. He'll mention that. Bakum will mention that. The way his example is equality is we're all going to sit in chairs. Equity is we all have to have the same head height. See the difference that he means? That's what those. Yeah, we'll talk through that later. But I just want to show you this so you can. So it's not scary. It's more frustrating because we're speaking different languages. This is a different worldview. And if you're experienced and you start creating your entire academic career around this, or your entire existence around this, or you look at the government or the police force or whatever it is through this lens, or even the church, since we're in Sunday school, through this lens, Lutherans are dominated by white cisgendered males in history. So therefore, see, we need to have more people of color and females become pastors to get rid of, see? Trust me on this one.
Yep.
You will find people that write like this way in the church. Okay, and so it's not whether it's because it's not about word and sacrament. See, it's about this. It's about power. It's about redistribution. See, that sort of thing. So you'll run into these sort of things in a lot of different places. I want to close again with good news and just remind us again. Galatians 3. We have this as our reading today. It was awesome. Galatians 3. There's neither male nor female nor Jew nor Greek. Right? We are all one in Christ Jesus. We are all one in Christ Jesus. We have to constantly remind ourselves of this because we are bombarded by this sort of thing. We are all one in Christ Jesus. So remind yourself of that. Read Galatians 3 and Ephesians 2 while you're at it. Just read Galatians 3, read Ephesians 2, and we'll kind of have some counter things for the culture, and have a solution. there is a biblical solution to a lot of these issues. And it's found in Scripture, of course. So let's go ahead and say the blessing on ourselves. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen.